tardes. La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, a través del Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte, les da la bienvenida a esta, que es la cuarta sesión del Seminario Permanente de Estudios Canadienses, que, dadas las circunstancias, continúa sus actividades de manera virtual. Antes de iniciar esta sesión, es conveniente decirles que las presentaciones que aquí se harán el día de hoy forman parte de un dossier especial que se publicará próximamente en Norteamérica, la revista académica del CISAN, y en el que participaron colegas de Canadá, México y también de Estados Unidos. Dicho compendio va a abordar temas diversos, contemporáneos de la realidad canadiense, y el año siguiente esperamos hacer una presentación más formal de este trabajo en el que hemos venido esforzándonos todos y todas desde hace algunos meses. Asimismo, quiero agradecer a los 8 autores que cumplieron en tiempo y forma con la entrega del material que hoy día se encuentra ya en dictamen por pares externos. Ello, pese a diversas vicisitudes personales que enfrentaron varios y varias de las involucradas, y por ello les agradezco mucho su compromiso, su profesionalismo, por haber hecho posible la conformación de este dossier que muy pronto nuestro público, estudiantes y colegas conocerán a mayor profundidad, y les pido que se mantengan pendientes por nuestras plataformas. Dicho lo anterior, voy a mencionar una breve reseña biográfica de nuestros invitados e invitadas antes de cada presentación, para que al final demos paso a los comentarios del doctor Gavin Friedel, que es amigo mío y colega huésped en St. Mary's University en Nueva Escocia, donde me encuentro realizando una estancia sabática de investigación. Posteriormente, vamos a dar paso a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Debo añadir por último que las preguntas del público en YouTube pueden ser escritas en español y respondidas en español por casi todos los participantes, hablan castellano, y sin problema sus coautores también, en este caso Lucy y Laura, pueden apoyar con alguna situación por ahí que no se llegue a comprender, porque pues bueno, fueron coautores en dichos artículos. Los colegas y las colegas que estén directamente conectados, pues bueno, pueden hacer, miembros del SPEC, pueden hacer sus preguntas libremente. Bueno, dicho esto, damos paso a la primera presentación que, aclaro, han sido ordenadas, al igual que en todas las sesiones previas, en orden alfabético del primer autor. Así pues, vamos a comenzar con Simon Granovsky-Larsen. Simon Granovsky obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de York. El doctor Granovsky-Larsen es profesor asociado de Política y Estudios Internacionales en la Universidad de Regina, en la provincia de Saskatchewan, Canadá. Sus líneas de investigación contemplan las ciencias políticas, el desarrollo internacional y los estudios latinoamericanos. Sus trabajos e investigaciones se centran en Guatemala y Centroamérica, analizando movimientos sociales y violencia política en América Central durante el periodo de la Reforma Democrática y neoliberal regional durante la década de los 90 del siglo pasado. En sus trabajos recientes ha estudiado la expansión de la producción de energía renovable en América Central, la violencia contra los defensores de la tierra y el medio ambiente, cambios en la violencia paramilitar, la militarización de las industrias extractivas, incluidas la práctica de seguridad de las empresas canadienses, y el papel de los movimientos sociales y los conflictos agrarios en el proceso de paz guatemalteco. A partir de la pandemia, Simón se ha convertido en un activo participante en diversos eventos organizados por el CISAN, lo cual nos complace muchísimo, y muestra de ello es su participación activa en este Seminario Permanente de Estudios Canadienses, SPEC. Muchas gracias, Simón. Damos paso a tu presentación, que será en inglés, titulada The Situation Will Most Likely Turn Ugly: Corporate Counter-Insurgency and Sexual Violence at the Canadian-Owned Mine in Guatemala. Adelante, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias, Oliver, por esta introducción, y antes que nada, Les quiero agradecer a Oliver, a la doctora Graciela Martínez y todos las y los colegas de CISAN por invitarnos a esta sesión. Yo creo que el dossier especial de la revista va a ser excelente, va a ser una contribución muy importante y es tan bueno que podemos estar aquí todos juntos, muchos de los y las autores de este dossier hoy. Before beginning the presentation, I'd like to make a couple of quick notes about my opening slide here. The first is in reference to the photo that I've chosen to use for a background slide. This is a photo of the open pit mine area of the Phoenix nickel mine in Guatemala. This is a mountaintop removal process. Those of you who are familiar with the mountains of Central America can imagine the green lush mountains that existed before the construction of this mine. This is also the traditional territory of many Maya Kekchi communities. And this mountain and the surrounding mountains contain innumerable sites of cultural and religious importance. The Phoenix mine, operated by a number of Canadian mining companies over a number of decades, was constructed within Maya Kekchi traditional territory without consultation or consent. And so this photo is important as an opening to show the environmental destruction of environmental, social, and cultural importance that the local communities have organized in order to resist. The second point that I want to make based on this slide is to explain the opening quote: "The situation will most likely turn ugly." This was written in an email by somebody from a local development organization in the area around the Phoenix mine and sent to the executives of the Canadian mining company operating this mine when they were consulted about a possible eviction of communities. This local development organization was urging against eviction, but as we'll see, the eviction went ahead anyway and did in fact turn ugly. The presentation today and the paper that I've contributed to this special edition is based on a court case that's ongoing at the Ontario Superior Court in Canada, and it's Kaal versus Hudbay. This is one of 3 civil cases being brought in Ontario, suing the Canadian mining company Hudbay for actions that occurred around the Phoenix mine in Guatemala. In this case, this is a civil case where 11 plaintiffs are alleging negligence and carelessness causing physical and psychological harm. This refers, as I said, to the Phoenix nickel mine in El Estor, Guatemala, which was originally owned by the Inco company from Canada, sold later to Sky Resources, which was the company that owned the project at the time of the events. It was later sold to Hudbay Resources, also a Canadian company, and because Hudbay acquired the Phoenix mine, it's now legally responsible for the actions that occurred when Sky was the owner of the mine. The case refers to the gang rape of 11 Maya Kekchi women during the eviction of communities surrounding the mine in January of 2007. As part of the ongoing court case, Sky Resources was ordered to release a collection of over 300 pages of internal communications. These were emails between Sky executives in Canada, between those executives and the project managers in Guatemala and their various consultants. This is an incredibly unique and important set of data because it offers a window onto the violence of Canadian mining companies and the decision-making of corporate actors in conflicts surrounding those mines. A recent study showed that 20% of all mining projects around the world involve the assassination of at least one opponent. And the majority of mining companies around the world are owned by Canadian companies. Canadian companies have particularly notorious reputations for violence surrounding their mines. A study by Imai et al. Found 44 deaths, over 400 injuries, and over 700 cases of criminalization related to Canadian mining projects just in the Americas. So this affidavit that released corporate communications is the first time that I'm aware of where we're able to see partially inside of the decision-making process as this Canadian company and its executives debated how to move forward with the evictions that eventually ended in these 11 instances of mass rape. The theoretical framework that I'm using to analyze these documents is what's known as corporate counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency, in its original and ongoing state form, is often referred to as a form of low-intensity warfare. This is a strategy of war that combines physical security with a number of other strategic elements as well. The collection of information and distribution of that information, the use of economic development funding, and a coherent political strategy, which are supposed to combine with physical security in order to establish control over a territory, to prevent the control of that territory by armed insurgents. This is a strategy which has its roots in the colonial era, but has been fine-tuned by the US Armed Forces. On the right here, we see a visual depiction of how these four elements of strategy are supposed to combine in order to establish territorial control against insurgents. Over the last small number of years, 5 or 8 years or so, there's been a group of authors who have been working around the concept of corporate counterinsurgency, especially Alexander Dunlap and Andrea Brock have really paved the trail on this one. Corporate counterinsurgency refers to cases where private corporations utilize the US government's counterinsurgency strategy. These companies view opponents of economic projects as insurgents. Even when we're talking about unarmed community members that are organized in social movements to defend territory from extraction or other large-scale economic projects, when corporate counterinsurgency enters, this is through an assessment of that opposition movement as one of insurgents. And so using the strategy of counterinsurgency to counter those supposed insurgents within social movements. Corporations use this strategy in order to attempt to establish control over territory, in this case for the purpose of extraction or other for-profit activity. Coin strategy has been used most commonly by extractive companies such as mining, oil, and gas companies, and also by private military and security companies. What I find especially useful about COCOIN, or corporate counterinsurgency, is that when we look at examples of repression against communities defending territory from mining or other extractive projects, the range of tactics that get used against those social movements is very broad and can sometimes be confusing in terms of the strategic purpose or even who the actors are behind those tactics. COCOIN as a framework allows us to see a more holistic strategy behind this range of tactics. In a paper that I published last year together with Larissa Santos, we tried to offer a framework that compares the four components of counterinsurgency with a range of tactics that we see active within corporate counterinsurgency. We based this on a comparison of two cases, another mine in Guatemala, the Escobal silver mine, and the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. In these two very different scenarios, we found the components of counterinsurgency to be present, and we found a set of 11 tactics, which were interagency efforts to bring institutions together alongside of the private companies operating corporate counterinsurgency, economic development assistance, the creation of lists of persons of interest in order to better counter that supposed insurgent threat, the use of military intelligence, the use of private consultants in order to establish risk and strategy for managing risk being posed by those social movements, the use of counterintelligence, deploying information into the community for the purpose of counterinsurgency, the use of counter-terror language, describing those social movements as terrorists, the presence of military and police operations, the coordination of security across private and public operations, and the frequent use of stigmatization and criminalization of activists. In the case of the Phoenix mine, looking at this set of data of 300 pages of corporate communications, In my paper, I argue that this is another instance of corporate counterinsurgency. Although this mine has been attempted to be constructed and operated since the 1960s, I'm referring specifically here to the period beginning in September 2006, when those corporate communications show there was an attempt to secure legal orders to evict communities from the land that was being claimed for the Phoenix mine, which those communities see as their traditional communities within Kekchi territory. Those efforts began in September 2006, and they culminated with a series of evictions in January of 2007. So here I'm going to go through the four elements, the four components of corporate counterinsurgency, and give some examples of how they were present in this effort to secure evictions. First, in terms of political strategy, the political strategy hinged on the work of the general manager of Sky's subsidiary, La Compañía Guatemalteca de Níquel, the Guatemalan Nickel Company. The general manager was a Guatemalan citizen on the ground within the subsidiary who liaised directly with Sky executives, but who also served as the entry point for liaising with key players within Guatemalan institutions. Together, CGN and Sky, mostly through the work of the general manager, engaged in a number of practices that we can see as part of this political strategy. They planned to pressure a judge. Now here you'll see I've put in brackets an exhibit number. This is to serve as citation, referring to the exhibits within the Montgomery affidavit that released these communications. To give an example, here's a quote from Sky's Vice President Operations, quote, "We expect to get the Coban eviction order signed today, likely, but we'll need to pressure the Puerto Barrios judge as someone may have gotten to him." They met directly with top police commanders. They also met with local army commanders in bases surrounding the mine. And they intervened strategically within a legal process to prevent negotiation. A number of actors invited Sky to negotiate with community members in order to prevent eviction, but the emails show strategizing aimed at preventing not only negotiation, but preventing legal orders to negotiate. I don't think I have a quote for that on my paper here. But the VP operations again said, quote, "Our position is the same from the bishop to the mayor to the campesino, no negotiations while they're illegally occupying our land, period." And what they did was they moved forward the legal process as quickly as they could so that a recurso de amparo, an intervention by a social movement representing the communities, wouldn't have time to be heard, and they could move forward quickly to eviction, which they did successfully do. In my opinion, Sky executives appeared to have maintained oversight and strategic control of this political strategy. As an example, we can look to an email exchange between one of the Sky executives in Canada and the general manager in Guatemala. In this back and forth, we have the vice president say, "As we discussed previously, we want no re-evictions to take place without the approval of Sky management." The general manager says, "I'm aware of this." VP, "Please assure me that we have all timing of any pending legal actions firmly under control." VP, general manager, "We do." And it goes on in that way, a back and forth that clearly points in this one exhibit to the fact, or to what appears to be the fact that decisions were run through the top corporate executives. In terms of economic development, Sky and CGN established an association, La Asociación Rache, in the area surrounding the mine. The association was focused on sustainability, and it was funded entirely by Sky and CGN. There was a budget of $500,000 US. We don't have very much information about how those funds were used, but there is evidence that some funds were directed from CGN through Rache in order to compensate in cash for some of the security funds related to the eviction. The economic development aspect doesn't appear to be very well developed or effective, but that's the case across both corporate counterinsurgency and state counterinsurgency as well. Those who are familiar with operations in Afghanistan will know that the money that was poured into economic development didn't do much to win over the hearts and minds of local villagers, but it did work in tandem with military operations to facilitate those operations. In terms of information, SCI and CGN compiled information on community leaders. One of the security consultants that was hired by SCI from outside of the country says, quote, in an email, "We know who the leaders are as well as all their followers. They established information sources within communities or organizations, although we don't know who those sources were. And they hired a former Army colonel to create an information sharing network between the armed forces and SCI, CGN, to facilitate military intelligence towards SCI. Moving to the final component, security. In the lead up to the eviction, SCI arranged for helicopter flyovers of the community. This was to maximize psychological impact. The armed conflict in Guatemala, which included the genocide against Maya indigenous populations, only ended in 1996. The armed conflict was very active in the exact region where this mine was built, often in connection to earlier attempts to establish the mine. And so the members of those communities were survivors of the war, survivors of massacres and genocide, and had within their own living memory the helicopter and plane flyovers of the Guatemalan armed forces. In reference to these flyovers that were suggested by one of the security consultants to SCI, one of the VPs says, quote, "It may be good if our regular flights did some circling over the important areas for psychological impact." SCI went about assembling over the course of about a month and a half, a joint public-private security force that was housed on CGN property. The accommodations and food were paid for and put in place on the property of CGN. 125 soldiers lived, police officers lived temporarily on the mine site, as did 65 soldiers and at least 57 private security officers. Then on the day of the eviction in question, it's alleged in court that teams were formed of between 7 and 9 men who were made up of, each team made up of a combination of police, military, and private security based on the uniforms that they're wearing, who moved between the village, and multiple teams surprised the women within their houses and raped them. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I think it's important to understand the terms of the events of this day. There were a series of evictions. The first evictions were carried out on January 8th and 9th, 2007. Those were without the most egregious acts of violence, which occurred in a second eviction on the 17th. Asked in court during the Ontario court process about why the company chose to re-evict, because members of the community had been evicted and then returned to their land again within days. SCI's VP Legal Affairs was asked about this and answered, quote, "We could have done nothing, but the longer you allow people to maintain there, the bigger and more sturdy structures they build, the more chance of them bringing in weapons, children. That's why we did it immediately." They chose to extend their eviction order and apply it to a second eviction on January 17th. This time, this was the instance where 11 women were gang raped. They were raped by teams of men in this combination of uniforms who arrived silently. Women in their testimony testified that they had no notice of the arriving eviction, and that for many of them, the men appeared in their homes and attacked without any form of warning. A further significance of this is that the tactics mirrored the sexual violence across Guatemala, but specifically in the same area during Guatemala's armed conflict. The El Estor region around the Phoenix mine was the site of a set of systematic sexual violence that resulted in a landmark 2016 ruling in Guatemala that recognized that sexual violence had been deployed as a strategy of warfare, specifically in the El Estor region. This is the Sepulsarco case for those who want to read more. Jo Marie Burt, in analyzing that 2016 ruling of the Sepulsarco case, said that sexual violence in the El Estor area during the armed conflict was, quote, "designed to destroy not just the bodies of the victims, but the broader body politic." In my own assessment, after reading the testimonies and the internal communications, I see that the rapes from 2007 appeared to serve the same purpose. After attempting to evict the communities on January 8th and 9th, public and private security officers returned to the site in what to me appears to be a vindictive act of gendered violence that was intended to put down the resistance by attacking the women of the community. When we have instances of corporate counterinsurgency, these remain under the strategic control of corporations. These can be extractive companies, or in some instances, private military and security companies that are hired by those extractive companies maintain the strategic control. But they always rely on coordination with state institutions and with public forces as well. In this case of the Phoenix Mine and Sky Resources, I think we can add the analysis of two important sets of actors. On the one hand, international consultants, and on the other hand, Guatemalan elite networks. So this is a figure that I put together with Larissa Santos that will be published hopefully in the article that's part of the dossier for Norte America. I realize this is a lot of information to flash on the screen, so let me give you a little bit of a guideline here. We have at the top Sky Resources and their subsidiary, the Compañía Guatemalteca de Níquel, working for the strategic goal of control over territory in order to enable extraction. What we have depicted in this figure is Sky and CGN working through a series of collaborators, both international collaborators on which would be this list here, and Guatemalan collaborators on this list here, ultimately working through the Guatemalan state, mobilizing all of these resources and actors in order to secure this goal of Sky's, the control over territory in order to enable extraction. On the part of the international consultants, this is something that's actually quite common to see around extractive projects. International consultants enter into extractive projects within the framework of corporate social responsibility. Extractive companies often want to be seen as responsible, but they don't want to change their core practices or their goals of extraction for profit. And so consultants are hired, anthropologists, sociologists, environmental consultants, and more, in order to establish supposed social license. But in establishing that social license, the non-operation of the project is not an option. In the Phoenix case, very important within this series of consultants was a range of security consultants, both based within the United States, mostly based within the United States. Those security consultants had a bit of a contradictory role. They were seen in many instances urging against the evictions. They didn't agree with the strategy of evicting, but they still played a role within this counterinsurgency campaign. They helped to secure the intelligence that Sky used. And they also drafted talking points that could be used to deflect international criticism of the eviction. Moving to the other side, the Guatemalan collaborators. Now, as I mentioned, it's my personal opinion that the ultimate responsibility lies with the transnational corporation in this case, but that, of course, is being determined in court. But it is clear that Sky relied on local actors to navigate the local political context. There's been excellent work done by Mariela Aguilar-Stone and Benedicte Bull, which argues that there's a symbiotic relationship within Guatemala between transnational mining companies and local elites. Local elites help the transnationals to gain local investors, they provide services, and they introduce contacts within Guatemala that the transnationals can use to navigate the corrupt political system within Guatemala. On the other hand, the transnationals provide those same elites with lucrative contracts, and they provide them with the ability to reproduce and maintain their influence within Guatemalan elite networks. What we had here in brief, because I think I only have a couple of minutes left, was through the general manager in Guatemala, introduction to key consultants and to individuals within the Guatemalan state, within the national police, within the armed forces that were involved in the mine. All of this helped Sky have access to Guatemalan political institutions and to gain the recommendations of local players as they put together their strategy for eviction. In corporate counterinsurgency, we often find evidence of collaboration between extractive companies, private security, and public forces. What's harder to identify is what we see in this case here, the unofficial dealings between company executives and local power brokers. The Sky or Phoenix case, through this Montgomery affidavit of corporate communications, shows just how important these unofficial relationships between local power brokers can be, especially when we're talking about large transnationals operating in other companies where they need local assistance in order to navigate local political structures. Future studies of corporate counterinsurgency should really pay attention to these relationships. You can do that through corporate communications, as we have in a rare example with the Montgomery affidavit, or it could also be done very carefully through extensive field work on the ground. Quickly, in conclusion, what I've presented here, I think a key point is that we can look to the corporate counterinsurgency framework as one that helps to decipher corporate repressive campaigns. Speaking with people within communities and social movements on the ground, in some cases there's a confusion about actors and about what tactics to expect and how they fit together into a whole. The framework of corporate counterinsurgency allows us to look neatly and understand a more holistic strategy behind these tactics. We have a rare window onto corporate decision-making offered through the Montgomery affidavit that allows us to see how one particular corporation navigated its repression of the anti-mining movement. And for those who do similar research, there is a lot more within that affidavit that could be looked to in addition to what I've presented here. It's important to note that rape is present as a strategic weapon in some corporate-led campaigns, just as it's used as a strategic weapon in war. And I think that's something that warrants some attention as well. International consultants and Guatemalan elite networks were integral to the Phoenix corporate counterinsurgency campaign. And I think that future studies of corporate counterinsurgency should explore roles that local elite actors hold within counterinsurgency. To close, I would like to acknowledge some very important help that I've had from many people. First of all, the women of Lote Ocho in El Estor, Guatemala, who were brave enough and insisted on carrying forward this legal fight, and who also made their documentation from the court case public, allowing me to do this research. I'd also like to thank Larissa Santos for research assistance, Catherine Nolan and Emily Grafton for feedback on earlier stages of the research, and Shirk for funding that made the research possible. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Simón. En verdad, muy interesante el trabajo que presentaste. Tuve la oportunidad pues, de leerlo cuando me lo hiciste llegar para el dossier y llegan pues desde luego un montón de preguntas y analogías con el poder, la influencia, toda la red de complicidades, de corrupción que tienen estas compañías mineras y que se hacen presentes en América Latina, de manera particular en Centroamérica. Es terrible lo que sucede. No hay que olvidar nunca el golpe de Estado que se da en Honduras contra Zelaya, cuando está con una política nacionalista contestataria, todas estas compañías canadienses y el papel que tuvieron dentro del propio golpe de Estado y las comunidades, pues lo que sufren es inenarrable. Muy interesante. Muchas gracias, Simón, de verdad. Muchas gracias por este interesantísimo presentación. Ya tendrá tiempo Gavin de expresarnos qué piensa. Bueno, vamos ahora con la segunda presentación del día de hoy. Será hecha por nuestras colegas y amigas Luccisano y Paula Maurutto. Les platico. Miren, Universidad de York, profesora asociada del Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad Wilfrid Laurier, Ontario, Es autora de diversas publicaciones. Sus líneas de investigación abarcan temas de sociología política, desarrollo internacional y de género y política social mexicana. Imparte cátedras de Introducción a la Sociología, Género y Desarrollo, Pobreza y Desigualdad Social en su universidad y también da cursos en el programa de posgrado en Sociología. Al igual que Laura, Lucy ha trabajado en el CISAN, Laura MacDonald, en diversas ocasiones. Es participante activa y entusiasta en proyectos institucionales del CISAN y en este mismo seminario. Incluso hizo hace algunos años una estancia de investigación en el CISAN, de manera que es una amiga cercana de nuestro centro. Muchas gracias, Lucy, por tu presencia el día de hoy. Ahora les presento a quienes no la conozcan en YouTube, a Paula Maurutto. Ella es doctora también por la Universidad de York, profesora asociada en el Departamento de Sociología e investigadora de la Universidad de Toronto, Mississauga, Ottawa. Sus áreas de estudio contemplan el análisis del sistema legal canadiense en tribunales especializados. Es autora de diversas obras y los resultados de su investigación la han llevado a dictar conferencias en la Asociación de Abogados de la Corona de Ontario. Sus cursos actuales están relacionados con temas de criminología, derecho y sociedad. Recientemente, Paula participó con nosotros en un proyecto PAPIT que dirigimos y su contribución puede leerse en el volumen 2 de nuestro libro Canadá y sus paradojas en el siglo XXI, donde trabajó un artículo conjunto precisamente con Lucy. Esta es una dupla genial que ustedes van a tener la oportunidad de leer. Thank you very much for your presence today, Paula. Ellas nos van a presentar su ponencia titulada How Conservative Policies Have Shaped and Deepened Social Inequality in Ontario. Muchas gracias. Adelante, chicas.
Gracias. I'm just going to share the PowerPoint. I'm assuming you can see them and that you can hear me.
Yeah. Everything is okay.
Wonderful. Great. So I want to begin by thanking Oliver, Claudia, and the others who helped organize this session. This is a very different presentation. It's on Premier Doug Ford of Ontario. And Lucy and I were interested in understanding the shifting politics and rise of neo-populism in Ontario and the implications for social provisions in the province. Lucy and I will be jointly speaking. I'll provide an overview of some of the characteristic features of Ford's leadership, and then Lucy will dive into a case study examining Ford's policies, essentially as cuts to education. Methodologically, we draw on a range of sources, including newspaper articles, government documents, reports by nonprofit organizations, as well as 13 interviews with members of the Ontario Provincial Parliament, teachers, government workers, senior administrators in healthcare and education. In 2018, Douglas Ford, Robert Ford Jr., won his first majority government in Ontario. He recently won a second election in June of this year of 2022. He is the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, and he defeated the Liberal Party that had been in government for 15 years, from 2003 to 2018. When elected, he was often described as the Trump of the North, yet he advances an Ontario style of neoliberal populism that's markedly different from Trump and from the typical populist leaders both internationally and nationally. To understand Doug Ford's support base and his rise to power, it's useful to begin with his initial trajectory into politics. Neoliberal populism in Ontario actually emerges at the city level in Toronto with the election of his brother, Mayor Rob Ford, in 2010. So one of the images here is of a book cover titled Ford Nation, Two Brothers, One Vision. Doug Ford is at the top, his late brother, Mayor Rob Ford, is at the bottom. So Mayor Rob Ford was the controversial neoliberal populist leader who was mayor of Toronto from 2010 to 2014, who acknowledged having a substance abuse problem after being videotaped smoking crack cocaine. And this was popularized in the media. But while he was mayor, Doug while he was mayor, Doug Ford was a city councilor within Toronto. And Ford Nation emerged as a moniker that the brothers used to propel popular support for their elections. You would see signs in the suburbs of the cities in support of Ford Nation. And Ford Nation also refers to the support base, which was primarily located in the suburbs of Toronto. This map is the Toronto municipal election, where Mayor Rob Ford won a majority. Blue is the area where Rob Ford won support. That's the conservative area. The downtown center core is in red. This is where the centrist candidate Smitherman won support. But the surrounding blue areas, so the blue areas include a mix of rich, wealthy, upper-class neighborhoods, but also on the fringes of the city are poor areas, which include racial, ethnic, and religious groups. This is where many newcomers first come to settle when they come to Ontario or to Toronto. Mayor Ford's electoral base is from the suburbs, the blue areas of the city. This is known as Ford Nation, and this becomes Premier Ford's base of support as well. This is Ontario Premier Ford's election, maps of his election, of the election results in 2018 and also 2022. And what you can see is that the majority of Doug Ford's, the premier now, Doug Ford, his electoral base is from the suburbs surrounding major cities, the blue areas. The North voted NDP, that's the orange area, and some areas voted Liberal, that's demarcated by red. And when you see a blow up of the downtown cities, the downtown city centers in cities like Windsor, Toronto, Ottawa, they tend to vote Liberal or NDP. But it's the suburbs around the cities that voted for Ford. Ford won 76 seats, which landed him a majority victory. So I want to now focus on I'm going to briefly outline some of the characteristic features of Premier Doug Ford's distinctive neoliberal politics. One of the central targets of Premier Ford is his attack against the downtown cultural, political, and urban elites. These are the ones in the red and orange areas. These are his political rivals, whom he frames as out of touch downtown elites. He blames them for heavily taxing hardworking people, resulting in what he described as this ratcheting up of the provincial debt. Ford's electoral support is drawn from the city suburbs that include this mix of wealthy white suburbanites, but also an eclectic mix of religious, ethnic, and racial groups. Ford specifically avoided the xenophobic, racist, and anti-immigrant claims made by other right-wing populist leaders. Because his support mainly comes from this mix of ethnic and racial groups. So this distinguishes him from Donald Trump in the United States or other populist leaders who promulgate this sort of anti-immigrant stance. But it's also distinctive from right-wing populist leaders in parts of Western Canada. Ford embraces diversity. He regularly appears at cultural events and ensures that he's photographed with the everyday people of Ontario. He wears culturally appropriate attire. These are photo ops with the Indian, Sikh, and Muslim communities. He also appeals to the everyday working man, and he adopted this folksy communication style that made him relatable and likable. Ford's distinctiveness lies in his pragmatic demagoguery rather than his ideological messaging. He's a businessman, ready to exploit issues in order to appeal to the everyday ordinary voter. Unlike other populist leaders, apart from not adopting this anti-immigrant stance, he also doesn't espouse an ideological commitment to traditional family values. In 2019, he was the first conservative premier to march in the Gay Pride Parade. There were other premiers from other parties that had marched with the Gay Pride Parade, but he was the first conservative premier. And he's been described as rewriting the conservative playbook on LGBTQ rights. As a pragmatist, he pivots and shifts his policies to appeal to the public. But like other populist leaders, what he does share with Trump is he promotes business development, and he was very active in promoting business development in Ontario. Ford's business platform, which was enshrined in the Making Ontario Open for Business Act, resonated not only with the business elite who support his free market reforms and privatization, but his platform appealed to middle-class and blue-collar workers living in the suburbs. He promised to not only reduce government regulation and cut business taxes, but he argued that would stimulate economy and jobs for those living in the suburbs. However, in order to do that, he claimed he had to keep wages low. So once elected, Ford halted the proposed increase in the minimum wage from $14 to $15 per hour. So wages remain frozen at $14 per hour until 2020. He also repealed the provision for equal pay for equal work and reduced employee compensation. This is the same slide from before. I'm just going through some of the other characteristic features. And one of them is undermining administrative structures. Another signature move was to undermine these administrative structures, both at the municipal level, sort of amalgamating municipal council, but he also cut public health boards and education boards. He also introduced among the deepest austerity cuts since the Harris years by slashing daycare subsidies, funding to healthcare, libraries, child protection agencies, and programs for autistic children. He attacked and reversed environmental protections and repealed the cap and trade program designed to control greenhouse gas emissions. He canceled poverty reduction initiatives. And while the province is grappling with the housing crisis, he removed rent controls. He reduced funding for universities along with slashing student aid. And in response to these broad austerity measures, protests erupted across the province, delivering a blow to Ford's approval ratings. On May 1st, 2019, the day known as International Workers' Day, labor groups called a general strike against Ford. It was called a general strike against Ford with demonstrations in 26 cities across the province. And there are multiple other protests against climate change, cuts to healthcare and education, among others. So by the end of 2019, Ford's approval rating had plummeted. There was only about 20% of voters who viewed him favorably. And then the pandemic hit. With the pandemic, Ford quickly shifted gears, toning down his neoliberal and brash persona. He represented himself as a professional statesman who listened to medical experts. During the pandemic, when other leaders dismissed scientific evidence and downplayed the importance of the pandemic, he imposed strict lockdowns. Toronto had the longest continuous lockdown in the world. Ford regularly appeared on television wearing a mask in public while expressing his concern for all those affected. This distinguished him from other populist leaders in Canada and internationally. His populist appeal bounced back to a record high of 74% by May 2020. And in many ways, the pandemic operated as this smokescreen that masked more in-depth cuts to social supports. So he engaged in this dance where he was claiming to provide funding for healthcare and education while instituting measures that quietly eroded these institutions. And in June 2022, this past year, he won a second majority election. So I'm now going to turn to Lucy, who's going to discuss fundamental changes to public education.
Okay, so carrying on with what Paula has set the stage for me to go into one particular case study to look at education and how Ford populism is about hollowing out our public institutions. So in Canada, education is under provincial jurisdiction. The objective of the Ford government was to, let me just fix this here. The objective of the Ford government was to undermine public institutions and accountability measures across the province while restructuring and privatizing publicly funded social services. We draw on the educational sector, including primary and secondary education, and school boards, education unions, and teachers to demonstrate the Ford tactics used to undermine and hollow out a public institution. Ford's agenda to privatize and dismantle education was facilitated by the Mike Harris conservative common sense revolution during the years of 1995 and 2002. In particular, Bill 160, the Education Quality Improvement Act in 1997, fundamentally restructured Ontario's education system. Bill 160 centralized provincial control over educational finances and program delivery. Significant decision-making on education that used to be done by the 72 individual school boards in Ontario shifted to the provincial government. So it shifted to greater centralized control. This was a bold move, a move that gave increased decision-making authority to the province. This and other neoliberal reforms, particularly the sweeping cuts to social programs and education, laid the groundwork and the building blocks for Ford's neoliberal populism. So in education, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through these four points that I want to raise. I'm going to look at the significant budget cuts from 2018 to 2022, the implementation of Ford's modernization of education policy, the Ford strategies to empower parents while bypassing unions, teachers, school boards to undermine public institutions. And I will be looking also at the privatization of education and the weakening of public institutions. So to begin with here, the significant budget cuts that we see happening in education have been quite significant. Ricardo Trajan's research demonstrates how education funding in Ontario has dropped. So from 2017 to 2018 to 21 to 2022, education funding has dropped by $1.6 billion. Less monies are now available for school boards. For example, one of the largest school boards in Ontario, the Toronto District School Board, saw its funding decline by $186 million from 2017 to 2022. So they're not only cutting, but they're also withholding money. The Ontario Financial Accountability Office reported that during COVID-19, the Ford government withheld money in the amount of approximately $900 million. Monies that were earmarked to support education in areas such as programming, staffing, school repairs, HVAC systems, and air conditioning installments. Schools are now particularly understaffed and facing a growing multi-billion-dollar repair backlog. So that's just the picture in terms of the impact of budget and budget cuts. Now I want to turn to what he has transformed and talks about education in terms of modernizing of education and shifting to online education and commercializing education. In March 2019, the Ford government unveiled the Education That Works for You, Modernizing Education, Modernizing Classroom Plan. The reforms here were aimed to enhance students' digital skills by improving broadband internet access to students from kindergarten through to grade 12. There was a commitment to really strengthening students' digital knowledge and digital literacy. However, the more conservative elements of the plan was a new requirement that students take 4 online courses in high school. A proposal that would transfer part of the student's education from the classroom to the internet. The move to online learning is one reflection of the Ford's larger plan to commercialize education through e-learning. Also, another controversial element of the plan was increasing class sizes in the classroom at the intermediate and secondary levels, with high school classes increasing from an average of 22 to 28 students. This is an average size. So some schools find themselves now with 35 students per class. So for example, my son is in grade 9 and he has 35 students in his classes. So this was quite controversial. And the then Minister of Education, Lisa Thompson, in 2019, responded to the unhappiness of Ontarians who were reacting to these changes. And her response was, well, bigger class sizes make students more resilient. She went on to say that students are currently lacking coping skills. They're lacking resiliency. So the students, in response to this, actually staged a number of protests. Students staged protests, parents staged protests, and on April 6, 2019, we saw some of the biggest educational protests that hadn't been seen since the years of the Mike Harris government. And so in response to this, as Paula was saying, Ford does pivot and backtrack. He backtracked on one piece here, that now online, the 4 mandatory online courses are now 2 online courses at the high school level, but the students could opt out. And so that was retracking from a previous position. What I want to shift into now is how what is happening in terms of hollowing out education. There are strategies in place, and one particular strategy is the Ford government and how it tries to connect to parents, empowering parents. But by doing this, it's specific, it's strategic, and it's a way to undermine unions, teachers, and school boards and school trustees. When it came to education, one of Ford's moves was to empower by consultation. So the Minister Liche was often heard invoking statements like, parents need to know, I want to reassure parents, and parents have little tolerance for, and we are listening. And so here, what Ford did, no, I think I just, yeah, just a sec. Okay, what Ford did was 2 ways in terms he does this empowering of parents. 1, he does it through empowering by consulting, and 2, he does it empowering through the media. The first one, the empowering by consulting, when it came to education, and during the 2018 election, Ford vowed to enact a parent bill of rights that would empower parents by providing them with direct input into educational planning. Following the election, he continues with looking at parents and wanting their input. So he actually has the largest type of consultation where he's reaching out to parents and he wants their opinions on all sorts of things related to education. Over 7,000 public submissions were made. And one of the key pieces of this consultation was that parents said, we don't want bigger class sizes. However, that's not what the Ford government wanted to hear. And in fact, it buried the document, it buried that information. Reporters uncovered it and eventually came out. But this wasn't the piece that Ford was looking for. So it switches to empowering parents through the media. When secondary school teachers launched the rotating strikes in 2020, after failed bargaining negotiations, the Ford government skillfully issued media messages stating their concerns for the parents. And so again, this is where Stephen Liche and the Ford government, Stephen Liche as Minister of Education, really were talking to parents, and that was a strategic move. And an interview with a teacher in August 2015-2022, the teacher who has 25 years of education, a seasoned teacher, argued that rather than showing up at the negotiation table with unions, the Minister of Education was negotiating through the media. They would like to see the whole system collapse so they could blame it on unions and greedy education workers and usher in an area of private education and e-learning. So these sentiments were also picked up by school board trustees in terms of this way in which the government was negotiating in the media rather than negotiating at the table. Never before, this is from the school board trustee, never before have we seen the Minister of Education communicating directly with the media. And similarly, during the pandemic, the school trustee said she would hear information about school policy and closures in the media rather than being briefed beforehand. As elected school board trustees, we felt this was a move to cut us out, to weaken our roles, and to weaken our positions. So here now I'm going to switch to how there's also a move to privatize education and the weakening of public institutions. So during the pandemic and into the fall of 2020, the Ford government began a trend of shifting funds from public education to individual parents. In a tweet, Education Minister Liche said, "Safety and parental choice will guide the way forward for the post-pandemic education system." Indeed, during the pandemic, while schools were facing budget cuts, the Ford government used parental choice to garner support for their policies. The government introduced a series of payouts to parents to assist with all sorts of things, including strike days. The parents received money to help support them during strikes. Parents also received money for other things to support them during the pandemic. And these monies range between $200 and $500. So rather than investing in schools, making schools reliable and safe for students to use them during the pandemic, those repairs were not done as per expected. Rather, parents got money during the online schooling, and that money was between $200 to $500. The important part here is these individual payments add up to quite huge sums of money. Additional amounts, one figure being $865 million in 2021 alone, with additional increases to a total of $1.8 billion. So the government continues with these ways in which it gives individual small pocket change to parents, but doesn't invest in the overall educational system. Just this August, with the new budget that came out in August of 2022, the finance minister speaks to parents and says, "We're going to listen to parents. We're going to listen to many people. What's the best way we can deliver the right type of funding to support parents who know their children best?" So it's a justification to, rather than invest in the system, it's a way of hollowing out the system slowly, and it's sustained. Under the plan that was launched for education, the plan to catch up, and this plan was part of, there's a concern that kids lost skills in math and math and English. So rather than invest in the public education system, the plan to catch up, which is worth $365 million, was allocated in direct financial relief for parents as another initiative to fund pandemic recovery learning. So parents now can apply for $200 for tutoring support, and this really is petty cash for families, but huge amounts of monies that could have been invested in education. And so what we see here is this is now the fourth move to give parents cash rather than putting it into the public education system. One provincial politician we interviewed hit the nail on the head when she said, by accepting these direct transfers, Ontarians are participating in and literally buying into the privatization of education. And so here, this is really important for us to reflect on in terms of a key strategy in how public institutions become weakened and become weakened. They're not invested in, and then the public starts to lose confidence in public education, and many who are able to start to shift their kids into private education because they can't trust the public educational system. So in conclusion, the strategies adopted to restructure public education are emblematic of Ford's overall neoliberal populist approach. In this presentation, we outlined how Ford's unique neoliberal populist appeal departs from the more ideological perspectives espoused by other right-wing leaders. Rather than holding steadfast to ideological right-wing perspectives, Ford espouses a demagogic, pragmatic stance that allowed him to calculate a wide and diverse base of support, including people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds, as well as new immigrants. The slogan "Free Choice for the People" and parental choice allowed Ford's government to justify diverting critical resources away from public institutions and towards direct payments to citizens. As was seen in education, the deep underfunding of institutions, however, was often met with protests and widespread demonstrations across the province that tarnished Ford's image. As a pragmatic politician, when met with significant resistance, Ford's strategy has been to step back, pivot, and relaunch. And this allowed him to shift his persona during the pandemic and raise his popularity while dodging questions about the hollowing out of public services. However, just this week and last week, he pivots again. And there's another strike that's happening in Ontario. The educational workers, which are part of CUPE, so educational workers unions are the educational workers, which consists of custodians, teaching assistants, administrative staff, and other educational workers, are currently in the middle of a labor dispute. Last week became quite exciting to watch this unfold on public stage. They are the lowest paid educational workers. They make $39,000 a year. Two-thirds are women. They have jobs and use food banks. So these are the lowest paid educational workers. The Ford government did not want them to go on strike. As a way to prevent them going on strike, he used Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedom, the notwithstanding clause, to override labor rights. This was a big deal. Everyone paid attention across the country, from Newfoundland to British Columbia.
Lucy,
Yep.
Sorry, we have 1 minute.
Okay, I'm almost there. And so what happened here is that that Ford had to back down. He could not use the notwithstanding clause because the union movement, the unions came together across the country to support CUPE. And so the government had to repeal Bill 28. And this was really significant because now they're back to negotiating. And this is, Ford's popularity took a hit, but also what was also important is that Ontarians were behind this strike. They were behind the teachers, and the whole union movement has actually been given a recharge and a reboot. So I couldn't resist, but I wanted to bring that last part in terms of what's happening in Ontario. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Lucy. Bueno, vamos a dar ahora paso a la tercera y última presentación del día de hoy. El trabajo que ellos desarrollaron fue en conjunto. Laura MacDonald y Jeffrey Ayres. Los presento. Laura MacDonald es doctora en ciencia política por la Universidad de York. Se desempeña como profesora e investigadora en la Universidad de Carleton en Ottawa, en el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas y del Instituto de Economía Política. Cuenta con una vasta obra publicada que incluye estudios en política latinoamericana, política mexicana, de Norteamérica, política exterior canadiense, democracia y sociedad civil. La doctora MacDonald es un referente recurrente en medios de comunicación canadienses en temas relacionados con política económica de América Latina y América del Norte. Ha sido conferencista magistral en el CISAN y activa participante en distintos proyectos multidisciplinarios como el PAPID, que dirigimos de 2019 a 2020, y continúa colaborando con nosotros en diversas ocasiones, como es este Seminario Permanente de Estudios Canadienses el día de hoy, y su aportación que tuvo para el dossier. Muchas gracias, Laura. Les presento también a su coautor, es el doctor Jeffrey Ayres. Jeffrey es doctor en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison en Estados Unidos. Es profesor y director presidente del Departamento de Ciencias Políticas y Relaciones Internacionales y director del Centro para el Compromiso Global en St. Michael College en Colchester, en el estado de Vermont, Estados Unidos. Es autor de diversos trabajos académicos y, de manera particular, ha coeditado con Laura MacDonald un par de libros, como es North American Question, Regional Integration in an Era of Political Turbulence, de la Universidad de Toronto, de la prensa de la Universidad de Toronto en 2012, y también del libro Contentious Politics in North America, National Protest and Transnational Collaboration Under Continental Integration, en 2009 por la editorial Palgrave Macmillan. El doctor Ayres ha ocupado la dirección de investigación Fulbright en estudios norteamericanos en la Universidad de Carleton, Ottawa, y también ha sido 2 veces investigador visitante en el Instituto de Economía Política en Carleton University. Thank you very much for your presence today, Jeffrey, and for your collaboration in the dossier that will soon appear in our CISAN magazine. Okay, well, thank you, and su presentación el día de hoy se titula Shifting Boundaries of Control, the Quebec and Vermont-New York border in the Trump era and beyond. Adelante, por favor. Go ahead.
Muchas gracias, Oliver. Y gracias a todo el equipo de CISAN. Es un honor y placer estar con ustedes otra vez. Voy a empezar para no tardar demasiado. Y vamos a compartir la presentación. Voy a empezar y después va a hablar Jeffrey. Bueno, okay, I'm going to speak in English. So in this presentation, we're focusing on a situation that was intensifying before the COVID pandemic and maybe returning again after the pandemic. And we're focusing on the ways in which borders have been redrawn, reimagined, and are being controlled in diverse ways in the contemporary context. To a large part, for understandable reasons, many people have focused on the anti-migrant and wall building activities of the Trump administration at the United States southern border. But there was also an intensification of tensions around border control during the Trump presidency at the northern border, particularly localized in the, especially the New York, Vermont area and its border with Quebec. So in this presentation, we look at this phenomenon on both sides of the border and increased processes of securitization and policing along this stretch of the northern border, which reveals, we argue, aspects of what's happening with borders in general in the modern world in response to diverse crises, rising migrant movements, and so forth. So just to jump in, we draw this sort of theoretical or conceptual framework from an author, Matthew C. de Souza, from 2018, who argues that we have seen in the contemporary era, or since World War II, shift in forms of regionalism that have been emerging, and the relationship between borders and how between regions and how borders are conceptualized, what role they play, and how they're policed. So in the old regionalism, so-called old regionalism, which coincided with what John Ruggie and others call embedded liberalism, borders and regions were seen primarily as a means of separation and territorial control, both in terms of economic policy. This is the embedded liberal part of this. The role of the state in economic policy was encouraged, but also in national security. The Cold War period and US hegemony in the West resulted in general in the reinforcement of borders, either at nation state borders, like traditional geographic borders, or in the case of the European Union, regional borders. Then we got a new phase of the so-called new regionalism, which didn't last all that long, from 1990 to around 2000, which was the era of the dominance of a new economic model, neoliberalism. And in this period, we saw borders and regions becoming, instead of hard boundaries between states, rather being playing the role of sort of filtering and sorting the movement of goods, people, and services across borders in different ways in different places, of course. So in this era of neoliberal globalization, we saw innovations in communications and transportation technology that facilitated this movement across borders. Again, more at some borders than others. And this coincided with the period of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And then finally, he argues we've entered into a new period after 2001, up till who knows when, which he calls comparative regionalism, where we see reemergence of the border control function in a context of destabilization of the world order, with innumerable crises, vicissitudes, and transitions, economic crises, political, ecological crises, and backlash against some of the impacts of neoliberalism, which did involve increased movements of people across boundaries. So in this period, we now see borders serving a number of control and control functions and functioning on excluding the movements of people but now not necessarily at the territorial border, but also away from the hard border, and border control functions are permeating and seeping into the geographic territory of the nation state. So I'll pass it to Jeff.
Muchas gracias. Mucho gusto. Thank you very much. Nice to see all of you. And so in the next section of our paper, we looked at, we applied these different frameworks, these different regionalism conceptualizations to changing processes of bordering in North America. And then I'll talk about this for a few minutes. Laura's going to move the slides for me, by the way. So we discussed, first of all, the old regionalism, where the international border between the United States and Canada has been a site since Confederation, if not before then, for establishing territorial control. We mentioned the dual character of the border as both an international legal boundary, but also the ways in which the border serves to reinforce political separate hegemonic discourses, that nationalist and securitized discourses. We talked about the cliche for so long of the world's longest undefended border, and the way in which the border has been experienced frequent waves of migrants. The new regionalism we applied, as Laura said, maybe more a brief time period to the era of free trade, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, where the bordering processes moved from, or the border itself moved from being a definitive separation between two territories to serving in more shifting and sorting processes. So through the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, and with the increased trade and strain on the border, different peoples, different goods, different services were increasingly expedited, or others didn't receive the same speedy processes for crossing the border. But we saw the border in the 90s into the beginnings of the 2000s beginning to shift, bordering processes shifting to sorting more and allowing for more rapid movement of certain goods and peoples. And then lastly, just again, the kind of quick conceptual application here, we talked a bit about how more recently we see comparative regionalism applying well, as Laura said, in this era of where bordering processes are not just located still at the border, the international legal border, but they're moving out beyond the border. We're witnessing delocalization and disaggregation of border functions. And we focused on, or we mentioned, three different examples. You're almost going. That's Sorry. Good. That's okay. One obviously is a major example of this is the Homeland Security political project after the terrorist attacks on September 11th. And we referenced the Smart Border Accord, the Safe Third Country Agreement, and then that carries forward for a considerable period of time. But then we focus particularly in our paper on the election of President Donald Trump and the further delocalization and disaggregation of border functions through nativist political projects, the Make America Great Again political project, revocation of temporary protected status, and we briefly mentioned as well a kind of third theme of the COVID-19 border being closed to non-essential traffic. And we have one, William Walters, who's at Carleton University. We referenced his work on remote control. I think I will read this. This kind of conceptualizes how we've taken comparative regionalism and applied it to the next two sections that we're going to talk about. Borders are becoming important not just as military or economic practices, but as spaces and instruments for the policing of a variety of actors, objects, and processes whose common denominator is their mobility, or more specifically, the forms of social and political insecurity that have come to be discursively attached to these mobilities. And we're going to do two little case studies of kind of looking at the Canada and US political projects now.
So in the last period, under the Trump presidency, we've seen bordering practices shift yet again in response to the fundamental changes in the political scene. And in particular, we argue that we see a clash between two projects of national identity building between, on the one hand, we have the election of Justin Trudeau in 2015, who has presented a carefully constructed political image of Canada based on, some of the historic ideals of the Liberal Party, a Canada that is globally inclusive, multiculturally sensitive and welcoming to refugees fleeing persecution, warfare, and seeking a better life. And he was particularly doing this in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. In the US, on the other hand, we have quite a different political project being enacted, one shaped by the xenophobic and racist pronunciations of the Trump administration. And in this context, the border represents a contact point and a point of tension between two very different political systems. So after Trump's election in 2016, increased numbers of migrants from diverse countries of origin suddenly began crossing overland into Canada in order to seek refugee protection. And this was partly because of the cancellation of the temporary protected status that several national groups enjoyed in the United States for many years as a result of political instability and insecurity in their countries of origin. These refugee claimants were able to take advantage of a so-called loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement that had been put in place between Canada and the US in the earlier period after the 9/11 attacks. And this agreement was designed to reduce the number of refugee claimants in Canada by saying that anyone who crossed the Canada-US border at an official point of entry would be sent back to the United States, because the United States was a safe place and it had similar policies to Canada. So why would they be able to make a claim in Canada if they'd already been in the US? They should make their claim in the US. But what happened in this period after Trump's election is that it was sort of discovered that there's kind of this loophole in the agreement, which means if you make your claim at an official point of entry, you will be sent back by border agents. But if you go cross the border in between the official points of entry, then you will be accepted into the country and be allowed to make your claim in Canada. So, we saw in 2017, 2018, large numbers, tens of thousands of people crossing the border in a very irregular and unusual, this is unprecedented kind of movement of peoples seeking asylum in Canada. And is highly localized in a very interesting way at one particular spot, which is what became famous in Canada, Roxham Road, which is a very small road on a very sleepy part of the Canada-US border between Quebec and New York State, but very near to Vermont. And this became a popular point of entry, partly because it was located near some international airports like the airport in Plattsburgh. And also migrants were actually welcomed by communities on both sides of the border. So active groups emerged to support these migrants who were trying to cross, often in very difficult conditions. We see sort of summary conditions here, but some in the right, but down below they're crossing in the winter, which is very difficult. They're going through fields and so forth. So you see in the graph in the bottom, the big spike in refugee claimants arriving in 2017. And again, this was a highly unusual and unprecedented situation in which, and we call this a sort of sorting and filtering. They're not held the process. They're allowed in. They're allowed to make a claim. They might be sent back later if their claim's not accepted. But we see unusual processes occurring at the border. And this situation became what we call a political football, or a target of widespread xenophobic response in Canadian society, but not totally widespread, but very localized in a way. In Quebec, you see groups like La Meute and the so-called Storm Alliance, which are very right-wing Quebec nationalist groups who respond to this situation. They call it an invasion of Quebec by illegals, discourses similar to those we hear at the US-Mexico border. They're waving their nationalist flag, sort of quasi-fascist types of groups emerging in this context. But at the same time, and I'll skip this. At the same time, we do see resistance to the anti-migrant discourses and to the Safe Third Country Agreement in general. So there was a legal challenge against the Safe Third Country Agreement that was called it unconstitutional. This has gone on for several years. And most recently, there was a case brought before the Canadian Supreme Court in Ottawa. This is a demonstration that occurred in Toronto. I have a couple of friends in this group here who are protesting against the Safe Third Country Agreement and saying that it is unconstitutional. It doesn't respect the rights of migrants. So there are contradictory political dynamics occurring around this unusual situation. And back to Jeff.
Yeah, and just quickly, from the American perspective, as Laura introduced, a different political project of disaggregation and delocalization, or the ways in which disaggregation and delocalization have at least supported during the Trump administration, although it has continued, the border site being used to police mobilities and being used to promote discourses of insecurity and control. And we remember Trump coming down the golden escalator when he announced his he was running for the presidency in the summer of 2015, when he talked about drugs and crime and rapists, and again the theme of making America great again, building the wall, our country is full. So the discourse has been particularly nativist and exclusionist. And I'll just some quick examples that we use of the way in which the border, and again, I live 40 minutes from the border here, and in fact, I live within this zone, for example, of enforcement of international checkpoints. I'm here in Burlington, Vermont, Winooski, Vermont, less than 100 miles from the border, where Department of Homeland Security can orchestrate internal checkpoints. Customs and Border Patrol can board buses here in Burlington and trains and ask for people's citizenship. So Vermont has been considered sort of ground zero for surveillance and an example of this remote control. I won't read through all of these, but we mentioned this earlier as well about certainly almost immediately after Trump became president, after he was inaugurated in January of 2017, there were a number of executive orders that were issued that also kind of promoted this remote control, re-legitimizing the boundaries of the imagined community. We list them there. During the Trump administration, significant numbers of arrests by ICE. And again, Trump threatening to eliminate birthright citizenship, Supreme Court review of DACA. And actually something very close to home here in Chittenden County, ICE and this Border Patrol. We have a very large Homeland Security operation here in Chittenden County nearby. And there's been a significant number of migrants, undocumented migrants, targeted and detained by ICE and the Border Patrol, particularly targeting a human rights group here, Migrant Justice, confiscating electronic devices. It's been found out that our Department of Motor Vehicles here in Vermont has collaborated with ICE and the CPB to identify people who seem to have names south of the border. Excuse me. And so those are some different ways in which just in this borderlands region that from the American political project has been accelerated, if you will, by these remote control or disaggregating processes. We conclude, again, by arguing that we're seeing shifting bordering practices that are reinforcing territorial identities, re-legitimizing boundaries of the imagined community. And we make the argument, I think, that fits with the comparative regionalism framework that these bordering processes in this little region aren't idiosyncratic. They're symptomatic of a broader disequilibrium in the world order. It's a particular political historical moment of xenophobia, populism, deglobalization. But as Laura emphasized, there's almost a double movement here. There is significant continued resistance on both the Canada and US side to these practices. And we'll conclude there.
Muchísimas gracias, Jeffrey. Muchísimas gracias, Laura, por sus interesantísimas presentaciones. Bueno, para no perder tiempo, vamos a dar la palabra al doctor Gavin Friedel. Quienes no tuvieron la oportunidad de que se los presentara, Gavin es mi amigo y colega anfitrión en St. Mary's University, donde estoy realizando mi estancia de investigación sabática. Hemos recibido todo el apoyo por parte de Gavin y a nivel institucional en su universidad. Están muy interesados en estos acercamientos que estamos teniendo desde el Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte. Bueno, Gavin, pues adelante con tus comentarios.
Muchísimas gracias. Thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me all right. Such great presentations. You know, this is actually a curse when you have such wonderful presentations, because then you have to think of smart things to say. So what can I do? And I don't want to take up too much time. So I thought, as I was listening to everybody talk, and what you, of course, there is one common theme in all three papers, and that's that they're very depressing, and that they're pointing us to a kind of political realities that I think many of us don't like to have to contend with. So I think the best thing I could probably do with three papers that are different is to come up with some questions for everybody. And so that I don't take up too much time, I think as I was writing my notes down here, I have two questions only for each paper for you guys to answer. I'll just go in the order in which they came out. The first paper with Simon, fantastic research and work as always, Simon. I have two questions I'll ask you, and then I'll move on and lay out all my questions so you guys can answer. One of them is a question I often get from students on these questions, but I think there's a kind of interesting depth to this question I hear a lot, and I'm thinking about the way that the mining company operated. And I think you mentioned $500,000 sort of poorly spent on a sort of corporate social responsibility projects. And I guess what I wonder about these questions, I'd love to know your answer of, is why don't these corporations do more on the good citizenship side? And I say this, of course, you and I, we both have the same sort of critique of global capitalism and all this sort of stuff. But I'm just wondering, for their own interests, how you would answer the question as to why these mining companies don't try a lot harder on the winning over the community side with funds, resources, schools, hospitals, and all that sort of side. Why they're so cheap on that versus the amount of money that they're willing to spend on the more militant and violent side. And then, connected to that, maybe a second question with this very horrible, tragic incident you've described for us, is I'm thinking about the local actors here that participated in it. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of what sort of pressures these local actors are under or are not. And in particular, how invested are they in the actual project itself? I'm talking about local security officials, the police, all these sorts of things. Are they invested in the success of the project in the medium and long term? Do they have an investment in that success? Or is their actions sort of an intensification of the way that military policing behavior might play out in that community on a regular basis when things get violent? or I'm thinking about whether or not it's linked in particular to them being politically, personally invested in the project and its success, or not. For Lucy and Paula, also such excellent research and so fascinating to hear, and also so depressing. You know, this presentation connects a lot to conversations that Oliver and I have been having based on Oliver's paper on populism. So there's, I mean, I could go on and on about this question about populism, but so that I won't take up much time, I'll just focus it on this and say, is this populism that Ford is doing? And if it is, then what is populism in this context? Because in a way, it's kind of interesting. You're describing how flexible he is, how he's willing to back down and adopt different strategies. You know, he doesn't need to draw on xenophobia. He's more pragmatic than he is ideologically committed. You know, I'm listening to it and there's a part of me that's thinking to myself that, because my own argument on populism is that populism is always involved in politics, and it's very difficult to brand one politician a populist and another not. So, I mean, you know, we could look at Trudeau federally, and I can give many, many examples, but, you know, our healthcare system is simply not functioning anymore. And yet Trudeau would pitch himself as being the prime minister that cares. You know, he's taking in money for carbon pricing, and he's writing a check and cutting a check and sending it off to people in Ontario so that they're getting a check in the mail, which they're going to use on climate change, which instead they'll probably just pocket and put in their bank accounts. So I see populism there. So I guess when I'm looking at Ford and looking at your analysis, I'm wondering, is it populism or is it popular? Is it an unfortunate reflection of the fact that this type of conservative neoliberalism is popular in Ontario? I'm not saying that I think it should be, but I would just ask you then, what part of it is that makes it specifically populist? And then linked to that is my second question. So I think coming from that is maybe part of the answer is the hollowing out of education shows a kind of populist agenda in a sense that it's not just only fiscal austerity, but it's also about weakening the institutions and privatizing them. And so I would ask maybe to explain that connection between hollowing out and populism, because I think I could also still ask the same other question, is that sounds like neoliberalism to me. Is it different than the kind of neoliberalism you might get from a liberal government? Certainly, I can tell you provincially here, a few years back, our provincial liberal government destroyed our school boards. So, you know, the hollowing out sounds very neoliberal to me. So again, I'm asking, but what specifically makes it populism? And I'm asking that partly to be provocative because I'm sure you have a good answer. And then finally, Laura and Jeffrey, also excellent research, and I really enjoyed your presentation a lot. Kind of hard actually for me to come up with a good question because I think you covered so many bases. But what I'm going to say is, where does the story you lay out connect to, and I think it's in there and what you're saying already, the idea of the imagined community at the end, for example, national fantasies. I feel like there's two interesting things that sort of strike me as having a bit of fantasy to them. And one of them is that if I saw that chart right, that I think it was Laura that went through, that there was this big boom in these refugee claims to Canada in like 2017, right after Trump gets elected, and then it kind of tails off. There's a kind of like recognition that maybe the situation in Canada isn't all that different than it is in the US for refugees, because I'm wondering why there's just that boom for that 1 year and then it just seems to drop down again. So was it just a kind of moment of Trump where all these Americans, of course, we all saw the news at the time, claimed they were all going to move to Canada, but I'm not sure that really happened. Again, I could be wrong. So was that a fantasy moment of Canadian fantasy nationalism playing out in a real world way? People were actually coming here, but then people quickly realized that it's not really all that different. And then the second question connected to that is this really interesting example of Vermont at the end, Jeffrey, where I'm quite fascinated. I have it in my notes here somewhere. You were talking about as ground zero. It's like, is there an actual ground zero there? Or is that all just sort of state building national fantasies there? Like, what does Vermont need to be policed so rigorously for? Is something actually happening on that border? Or is it almost entirely in the realm of, you know, Trumpism looking tough? You know, is there substance behind that? And even on issues that we would not agree as being the substantive issues of concern, is there something going on, or is it just good politics for Trump? So those are my 6 questions, and thanks everybody so much for such great presentations.
Muchas gracias, Gavin. Muchas gracias. Who wants to answer first? I don't know, Laura, if you have enough time to stay all the session, or I don't know. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, no problem.
Okay. If you think there is right, we can respect the order of the presentations, okay? Entonces vamos a darle la palabra primero a Simón. Adelante, Simón, por favor.
Wow, Gavin, thank you very much for these excellent questions. It's I'm really impressed that you were able to come up with such astute and difficult questions, 6 of them on the fly. Thank you for this. So your first question was why don't extractive companies, mining companies, invest more in winning over the communities? So first of all, I want to say that I think that corporate social responsibility is a sham as it's operated. I think that the first step needs to be the free, prior, and informed consent of the communities around an extractive site, with the possibility of vetoing and blocking a project. And only once that possibility is genuinely in place and license is given to a project, then we can start to talk about corporate social responsibility and what benefits local communities can gain. Absent that, corporate social responsibility investment stands in as in one sense, advertising to international audiences, and in another sense, compensating in a minimal kind of way. But in terms of your question, I think I can think of this in specifically around the case that I'm talking about, and a little bit more generally as well. Specifically in this case, and again, I need to be careful with how I discuss any of this with an open court case, but it's all based on public documentation, and this is my own assessment from some careful reading. Something that doesn't come into this paper that I'm planning to write another paper about is the attitude and the racial perspective of the mining company executives. And I think that from my reading of these documents that were created to be private and without the authors thinking that they would ever be released, and then of course they themselves released them through the court process, they were very candid. And my reading of the documents is that the mining company executives in Canada firmly believed not only that their mining project would be good for the economic development of Guatemala and for the economic development of the surrounding communities, but they believed that any opposition was a combination of the result of manipulation by outside social movements that were manipulating the perspectives of local communities. But I think more strongly was the result of ignorance of people who they saw as not understanding the benefits that they were about to receive. And so I think that there's a lack of investment in economic development, partly because they were so focused on the physical response. But they were so focused on that response because they truly believed that what they had to offer was the best for the surrounding community, and they were going to bring it to them regardless of what they were sort of wrongly believing about the project. And that, in the way that I see the language coming out in these communications, is steeped in an ignorance and a racialized discourse about the people that they're dealing with. Maybe I'll leave it there in answer to that question. In terms of the local actors, sort of how invested are they in the success of the project itself? I think I can really only answer this one in response in relation to this particular project again. But I think you have a lot of, it varies from actor to actor, but the key players in Guatemala, Guatemalans who were connected to the Phoenix mine in various ways, I think were very personally invested because of the contracts that were available, because of, I think from a political perspective, advancing extractivism in general and the militarization that accompanies extractivism. There's definitely a political push in the country to advance a remilitarization on the backs of social movements. And mining projects present an excellent opportunity for that. So there's people within the public forces that have that interest in mind. There's also individuals who benefit from contracts and connections by being connected to the mine. And then as the theoretical work around Guatemala elite networks show, it has a long-term impact of sort of showing importance and reestablishing connections and influence within broader elite networks to be connected to a transnational project of this sort. And so I think that this isn't a case of outside control by the transnational company. Absolutely, they held strategic control, in my opinion. But I don't think that it's a case of being duped by the situation. I think that they were very much invested and benefited personally from executing the evictions.
Okay. Muchas gracias, Simón. Lucy, Paula, please.
I think I'll start. So the question is, how is this populist? Part of what makes Doug Ford a populist leader, which is very different from perhaps Harris, is that Harris never talked about we the people, whereas Ford does. It's all about, he is for the people. Ford Nation is all about this populist rhetoric that you see in many of his speeches, particularly during the pandemic. He's for the people, for the regular guy, for the everyday working class person, but for business as well. He represents everyone. And that is linked to the second populist, one of the key features of populism is the undermining of other institutions, such as school boards, school boards, public health boards, amalgamation. I mean, Harris did amalgamate as well, but he didn't have the sort of broad-based restructuring of a lot of these intermediary institutions that provide local voices. Because what we saw with public health is rather than having sort of 34 regional public health units across the country, they're trying to merge that into one now. So that there is no local voice into politics, because if the premier has a direct voice with the people, you don't need these intermediaries. So there's an undercutting of that. So I don't know if Lucy wants to add something.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about what Paula just said, I often think about also what's happening in Mexico with AMLO, and this is some of the work that Laura, Paula, and I are doing. It's about cutting out, going right to the people, cutting out all these intermediaries so you have a connection to the people. He started off by talking about folks. Now it's my friends. And so this is important. And when we see it in education, it is how they're trying to link up with parents as a way of building these connections. And what these policies, because who wouldn't, if you're a parent, take on this $200 here or $500 there? By doing so, we're participating in the dismantling. So we are responsible if we're taking out this money, we're participating in the process. And I think that's also important, just to add on what Paula was saying in terms of the hollowing out. We are actively engaging and participating by applying for these funds but what we saw just recently with the big resistance and the union movement coming together, I mean, he went too far. And everyone reacted. Now it'll be interesting to see what happens after this, but I think he gave us the biggest favor in terms of what he did, because he pulled so many people together, even when many unions private unions had supported him during his re-election in 2022.
Okay.
So I just want to give, I'll pause for now and let Laura and Jeffrey answer their question.
Okay. Laura, por favor.
Thanks. Yes, also great questions for us, Gavin. Yeah, I was thinking when I saw the phrase imagine community on the slide, which I guess Jeff put in there, I was thinking, oh, we could have just rewritten this in terms of the imagine community literature, but I think it exactly shows what Benedict Anderson was saying about national fantasies or identities, that they are politically constructed and socially constructed. They're not, objective reflections of existing realities, but they're projects that elites are able to construct, drawing on sort of pre-existing ideas and values and dreams of populations, but elites are able to take advantage of different situations that emerge to present an alternative vision of what the imagined community is. And I think very much so that's what we're seeing in this context. So yes, I mean, there were a lot of people for the Canadian context, maybe not surprising in the US-Mexico context, but for Canada, it was a lot of people. It was a test on the Quebec state who, at one point housed these people, and then in the National Stadium, like there were resources involved. It's not surprising the Quebec state was worried about it. But, it's not like a huge number of people, but the fact that it's highly localized, I think is an important aspect, and it's at the border. So when something's happening at the border, it particularly tests conceptions of national identity. And it is in some ways similar to the caravans arriving at the US-Mexico border, which are again highly localized, concentrated movements of people in one or two specific spots that test local resources and the patience of local communities, right, in very interesting ways. It's not that so many new people were arriving at the US-Mexico border, it's that they were coming all at once in an organized fashion that really created the opportunity for people like Trump to say, we're being invaded, this is terribly dangerous. So I think the same thing was happening in the Canadian context, that this sudden, unusual, and highly localized and concentrated movements of people gave rise to diverse responses in Canada, and evoked this kind of xenophobic response, which, as Lucy and Paula have been pointing out, is not that common in conservative circles in Canada. And it could happen again, it was all put on hold. I didn't mention this during the pandemic. Nobody was allowed to make a claim at the border, so nothing was happening, but we are seeing increased numbers again. So it's not like this issue has gone away. And there is this very interesting court case that could end up rejecting the whole safe third country agreement altogether as unconstitutional. We're just waiting for that outcome. Jeff, you want to talk about Vermont?
Sure, very quickly.
Bucolic and peaceful Vermont.
Yeah, actually, that's the point. I mean, I think here we consider Vermont the most Canadian state, and that may not be such a good thing for some of you, but so no, I don't think, I like the question a lot. I think on the ground, no, there isn't something really going on. There hasn't actually been something really going on here. Yes, there are a very small percentage of people are crossing from Canada into the United States at the Quebec-Vermont border, but I would say it was more, and it may still be more if Trump were to return. It was more Trumpism looking tough in a state that's least Trump friendly. We have Bernie Sanders and Patrick Leahy, two of the most liberal senators in the country, both of whom are fiercely critical of Trump, but also of ICE and the Border Patrol and a lot of these debordering processes. Burlington, right across the river here, is a sanctuary city. So I think there are a lot of reasons why it was, and we really do have a large regional ICE, I don't want to call it headquarters, but regional facility right here. So it made it a handy, for a number of reasons, it was a nice, handy state for Trumpism to look tough. But you said these were depressing, but in some ways the Vermont is a really good example of the resistance. So there's a lot of resistance here. a lot of solidarity with migrant justice, really interesting border solidarity on the Vermont, New York, and Quebec side in support of the people seeking to leave the United States through Roxham Road. So I think there is that whole other story, and I really do feel it is a kind of double movement. There's the movement to construct this national fantasy or imagined political community, and there's a movement to try to deconstruct it or push back against it. But the bottom line is, I think it really has had a lot to do with it being a convenient place to be going after people who are the least Trump friendly of many in the United States. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Adelante, Simón, por favor.
Oh, thank you. I had sent Oliver a message to ask if I could make one more quick comment to Gavin. A better answer to the question of CSR and why there isn't more investment in attempting to win over locals to an extractive project. I think it's because, in my opinion, I think that mining company managers are well aware of the resistance that they're going to face. And also they know that they're going to be able to build their projects and use violence to ensure those projects, and that they'll be able to get away with it. And so I'm increasingly convinced that CSR investment, the audience that it's aimed at is international investors and home country governments that expect to see those measures much more than the local communities where CSR investment takes place, with an awareness that they aren't going to win those communities over and they have the ability to use force.
Ok. Muchas gracias, Simón. ¿Alguien que tenga algún comentario, alguna reflexión, alguna pregunta por ahí entre nuestros colegas del seminario? Aprovecho para comentarles que, bueno, este seminario ha tenido muchísimo éxito. Es el más nutrido desde que comenzamos este seminario de manera virtual. Algunos colegas se han tenido que retirar por cuestiones de trabajo. Michael Hoshman se disculpa, Catherine Vecina también, John Kirk, bueno, en fin, ha estado bastante nutrido. No sé si alguien quiera comentar algo. Nos veo muy serios, muy serias. Bueno, en mi caso, agradecer a Claudia Lucotti, que está aquí con nosotros, co-coordinadora de este proyecto, a nuestra directora, la doctora Graciela Martínez Salce, que está aquí también siempre a pie del cañón apoyando el seminario. Y pues bueno, en general, agradecerles a todos su participación. Ya habrá tiempo para que podamos intercambiar puntos de vista respecto a los términos del populismo, que sí, Gavin y yo los hemos venido platicando, son complicados y debemos de ir, vamos a encontrándole ahí una cierta línea que muy pronto vamos a sorprenderlos seguramente. Bueno, pues les agradezco. Palabras de Graciela. Adelante, Graciela, por favor.
Mira, primero, Oliver, lo que podrías hacer es organizar un diccionario trinacional del populismo y su retórica en México, Estados Unidos y Canadá. Y no sé si sería un libro muy divertido o que nos echaríamos a llorar todos y todas cuando lo leyéramos, pero podría ser una contribución del seminario, dado que tantas colegas y colegos están estudiando el tema. Creo que sería fascinante, ¿no?
Claro, podemos ahí trabajarlo, claro.
Y bueno, lo que les quería yo decir, nada más es una invitación. Ya van a recibir ustedes por correo electrónico la invitación. Ahorita la hago en inglés. Porque ayer en Gaceta salió publicado, en Gaceta de la UNAM salió publicada la reinstalación de la cátedra, que antes se llamaba Cátedra Margaret Atwood Gabrielle Roy, y a partir de ayer se llama Cátedra Extraordinaria de Estudios Canadienses, Margaret Atwood, Alani Sobomsawim, Gabriele Roy. Y la semana próxima vamos a tener el evento de la celebración de los 20 años de la cátedra, y con unas pequeñas palabras y la inauguración de la página de internet, en donde hay una pestaña muy bonita sobre el seminario. Van ustedes a recibir por correo la invitación. Va a estar aquí el señor embajador para celebrar estos 20 años. Entonces, ojalá y puedan acompañarnos en línea. Casi todos y todas están lejos, entonces ojalá y puedan acompañarnos en línea. Quienes están aquí, ojalá puedan venir. So in English, we will be celebrating the 20th anniversary of our extraordinary chair on Canadian Studies, which is called Margaret Atwood, Alani Sobomsawim, Gabriele Roy, and the ambassador will be here for the 20th anniversary celebration. We have a small recording from Margaret Atwood, and we also have recordings by Liliana Cordero and Laura Lopez Morales about Alani Sobomsawim and Gabriele Roy. We would be very pleased if you could meet us online next Friday, ¿verdad, Claudia? Sí, next Friday at 9:30 here in Mexico City. I don't know how are the hours right now in Canada.
En Halifax son las 3 de la tarde.
Two more hours here and 2 less hours on the other side. But we will be very happy if you can meet us. You will receive an email with an invitation. I don't know if today or Monday, but and then we will invite you through SPEC to see the small ¿cómo se llama en inglés una pestaña de internet? Well, SPEC has a special place.
A label, ¿no?
The label. Gracias, Claudia. SPEC has a special label in the web page, which is being fed by all these activities that Oliver and Claudia organize. And well, we will be very happy to that our seminar, I hope we will become even more visible with this page. Gracias.
Muy bien, muy bien. Pues bueno, les pedimos que estén pendientes. Vamos a hacer una presentación en sociedad del dossier. Espero que ya para el año siguiente podamos presentarlo. Está en revisiones en estos momentos los artículos. Muchísimas gracias. También las convoco. El siguiente seminario, la siguiente sesión del SPEC la vamos a tener en marzo. Principios de marzo. Queremos aprovechar la presencia de una colega que desafortunadamente hoy no pudo estar con nosotros, de Camelia Tigao, que está por ahí en la Universidad de Toronto. Entonces aprovechar que esté ella por allá para que también podamos tener algún trabajo dentro del seminario. Y pues bueno, invitarlas a mantenerse pendiente. Hay muchos proyectos que podemos generar. Por fortuna, aunque me encuentre lejos, podemos seguir coordinándonos y poniéndonos de acuerdo, ¿no? Estas maravillas. Muchísimas gracias, que tengan un extraordinario fin de semana. Es fin de semana largo en Canadá, es el día de los veteranos aquí, caídos en la Primera Guerra Mundial. Y pues bueno, pues por acá andamos, cuídense mucho y un gusto verlos, saludarlos. Gaby, nos vemos más tarde. Simón, bueno, todos, muchas gracias. Laura, Lucy, y Laura, bye bye. Saludos.
Dios.
Gracias.
Bye bye.